Look at census data, 1910, 1920, 1930, in places like Milwaukee, Chicago, Philadelphia. A young black kid was slightly more likely to be brought into a world with a father in the home married to the mother than a young white kid. We have incentivized this kind of bad behavior.
It's crazy because essentially you're talking about state sponsored forcing you to stay in a relationship that could be abusive in some cases, right? It could be mentally and
Hmm.
psychically abusive. I think it's the ultimate freedom is being able to choose who you associate with.
Right.
And if you're forcing people to stay married to people who they don't want to be, that's not freedom.
In America, 60% of the shootings, the robberies, and the homicides are committed by black people, often against other black people. Of the homicides in this country, half of them are black victims, almost all killed by other blacks. How do you explain that if it isn't for the absence of fathers? Are you prepared to say black people are just genetically inclined to commit more crime? I doubt it. And the go-to reaction often is poverty and systemic racism. Here's the problem. 1940, when there was blatant racism. This is before Brown versus Board of Education, before the Civil Rights Act of 64. KKK was still alive and well. 87% of blacks lived under the poverty line. Now it's about 14%. You can't blame it on poverty. You can't blame it on racism. It is the breakdown of the nuclear intact family, and neither side is talking about it. The left doesn't talk about it because they caused it with the welfare state, and our side does not talk about it because if you're white, you'll be accused of dissing single moms who are heroically raising these kids, or you'll be accused of being a racist, or if you're black, you'll be accused, as I was by the LA Times, of being the black face of white supremacy. Nobody's talking about that. I am.
What are the reasons?
So I think it does. I think again, I think fatherlessness affects it. The breakdown of the nuclear family. I think a lot of what Nate was just talking about definitely affects these issues. Obviously cultural attitudes about, whether people should work or respect handouts or what it means to succeed. These are all, these all affect it. The one criticism I'd have is I think Larry's a little too single focused on single parent households as opposed to taking kind of the broader view. Because there's one other thing, which is I don't know how good it would be to compare like black crime rates now to like pre-civil rights era, because I would expect a lot of black people would be afraid of like getting killed or lynched like back in those days. I don't know if that's like a good thing to be like, well, there was less crime. Like I don't know if that's a good metric to use in this conversation, but
Yeah, I think unfortunately, and this is where I take issue with Larry Elder's statistics because he's using the kind of the Jim Crow South and comparing it to the 2023.
yeah. Right.
So for instance, and a lot of people don't well, not remember this, but don't really know this, but there are a lot of famous Supreme Court cases from back in like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, where in the South, after slavery ended, the South had lost the war. On the legal technical side of the Civil War was really about do we have to follow the law? And the law was, we're going to end slavery. And the South said, we're not going to follow that law. And then that's when all hell broke loose. But then after they lost the war, now you have the 13th Amendment in slavery. So it's like, well, we still need these people to work and we still need slaves, but we can't enslave them. So there was the one exception in the slavery rule, which was the crime exception. If you can still be put into involuntary servitude through criminal acts. So the South started passing, obviously the Jim Crow laws and the black codes. Now, there was one famous case in the 50s, I think either the 50s or the 60s, in which the Supreme Court had to overturn this law. Now, the law is that if you were black, you would be arrested and can go to jail. And if you went to jail, you would actually be sent back to the plantations. And that would be your crime in society. And the crimes were things like if you were unemployed, if you were out during the day, if you were a child that was unsupervised, like it was crazy what you could be arrested for and convicted for. And a lot of people don't realize, like almost 90% of black people lived in the South. There's a belt. I've called it the black belt because I forget the name of the term, but there's a place in the South where like something like 90% of black people used to live, and they started moving to the North. because what happens is after World War II, back in the 40s, when World War II happened, the U.S. cut off immigration to Europe. So the car manufacturers up in places like Detroit and a lot of the major cities that depended on immigrant labor, like Ellis Island, New York, people weren't coming in. So the North was like, hey, we want all these people from the South. We have all these black people from the South who are now freed. We want them to come up. So they would start moving. So it's called the Great Migration. There were two of them. So the Great Migration, where you had the largest amount of people move from one state to, well, some of the southern states to the northern states. That's why now you see like Detroit has a large black population, New York, Chicago, those cities. And it's fascinating because in that move, you started seeing southern states started doing things like having police at the train stations, at the bus stops to stop black people from leaving because they made it illegal to leave. But what I think Larry Elders is doing is saying that, hey, crime back then was so low because those people back then were being oppressed by the criminal code.
Right.
Versus crime now is so high because these people are not being oppressed by the criminal code. So I think in comparing those two different time frames, I understand what he's trying to point that back then more people stayed together, but I think more people stayed together in black families because what else were you going to do? Right?
Necessity,
like,
yeah.
Yeah, like you weren't, versus now where you have the freedom to, where you know, if you were, like you say, like the welfare state and all this stuff, where they're not saying if you're black you can't get welfare. You can get it. You can get just as many amenities and things as white people can get. So now it's a totally different time. So I think comparing the two is a little disingenuous, but then his conclusion that it's all because of black fathers doesn't equate when you really think about it in a larger context.
People will do better in a scholastic situation if they're in a stable, if they have a stable home life, obviously. And that's regardless of race. I mean,
yes.
Yeah. So he puts a lot of weight on like fathers being in the home as a role model, but there used to be all these, Big Brothers of America, all these mentorship programs for boys and teens that I think kind of got defunded in a bad way. And those could pick up a lot of the slack here. So I agree with what both of you are saying about Larry Elders kind of putting all of his chips in this one basket of fatherlessness in the homes, when I think there are kind of a lot of different solutions that could be solving this problem.
Mm-hmm.
And what about also too, like another thing I do take umbrage with what he's saying is that what about putting some responsibility on those fathers to be more involved in their kids' lives too? Because I know a lot of those. I know a lot of black fathers who are not involved. Who are, okay, I'm out of here, and then they're on to the next one, right? So
Right.
I think there's a dual responsibility here. Where if I do have a kid with a woman, it's just not on her, right? It's on both of us to still co-parent this child. But a lot of times seems like he's almost giving the black fathers a pass and saying, okay, well, why are they leaving? Instead of saying, hey, we need to tell these people to be more involved in their kids' lives, and hopefully that, even though their parents are not together, they can still be a force in that kid's life. You know what I mean?
Well,
Definitely.
I think it's kind of the opposite. I think Larry Elder is saying that the father should be involved in their lives. That's the problem. Like he's saying, but I don't necessarily know what his solution is. You can't just force people to stay together. It's like,
yeah, that's
but
true.
a lot of times on the right, they'll say, look, we have this cultural problem that everyone's, having a bunch of kids and still messing around. They're out partying in their 30s and stuff like that. I don't know how you deal with that cultural decay. You can't really just force this kind of 1950s mentality on people, and I don't know how you entice them to do it either.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's a strange problem. So I don't know that we're going to come to any solution on it, but sometimes it bothers me when politicians come out and they say, listen, here's the problem. The nuclear family unit has fallen apart, and that's the problem. With that, I don't. How do you fix that problem? Is what I'm more interested in. But nobody really has any solutions there.
Right.
Yeah.
If your statistics are right, what are the reasons that you think fathers aren't in the home?
As I said, it's because in the mid-'60s, Lyndon Johnson launched what he called the War on Poverty. In Charlemagne, literally, they sent social workers door to door in the inner city. I remember this. Mm-hmm. advising women of the availability of welfare provided there was no man in the house. It created an economic incentive for women to marry the government. Same thing with whites. In 1965, 8% of whites entered the world without a father in the home, married to the mother. Now it's about 25%. Awful.
See, it's difficult for me to tell the causation here. Like,
Yeah.
are the guys, leaving the household and therefore the welfare is needed, or is it actually the guys are being kept away by the welfare? I don't really know the situation.
It almost is like he's saying that because women could get governmental services, they essentially kicked out the men, or the men. It had some negative impact on the men in the household, and that's the reason why we have fatherless households. It's like I don't see how he's attaching it together. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That is his argument. Yeah.
Well, there used to be a lot of cultural pressure, obviously. Your friends and family would say, "What are you doing? You're not treating that woman right, respectable, whatever." So, but that has sort of deteriorated. And I mean, it's deteriorated on both sides. I mean, I don't know about you, Nate. I'm married, so I'm out of the dating market, but I don't envy anyone who kind of is in the dating market right now, just because it seems like obviously it's a challenging market. Let's put it that way.
Oh yeah. But I think he's caught up back in it was better in the 60s versus, because don't forget, in the 60s, you couldn't divorce think about the laws back then too. Back then, you couldn't just divorce someone. They used to have in New York, they used to have what they call the Nightingale cases, where to get a divorce, you had to show that either your husband was cheating or something like that, or you had to show like adultery. But generally, women couldn't divorce their husbands. So to say that, so those homes were being compelled to stay together. You understand what I mean?
Mhm.
And in the 1960s, and remember, I don't know if you remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that sometimes back then, women couldn't even have their own bank accounts. And in some places in the United States. So, that time frame, it essentially, he's taking apart, I think, a piece in time where women didn't have the freedoms that they have of today, and saying, well, hey, that time was better. But it's almost like the causation is the more freedoms that we gave to the opposite sex led to them saying, hey, we don't want to live in these relationships with these sometimes abusive men, sometimes people we don't want to. We want to get out of them. And now that we can get out of them, we are out of them. But he's saying, no, maybe we should go back to that. And I don't know if that's the answer,
Mm-hmm. Do you have a response to, because we've actually argued with people on stream who've come on and they've advocated for a return to getting rid of no-fault divorce. They want to have these, make it very difficult for people to get divorced again legally.
You did the cringe face, Nate.
I disagree with it personally, but I'm curious as to what your take is on that.
But it's crazy, because essentially you're talking about state-sponsored forcing you to stay in a relationship that could be abusive in some cases, right? It could be mentally and psychically abusive. I think it's the ultimate freedom is being able to choose who you associate with.
Right.
And if you're forcing people to stay married to people who they don't want to be, that's not freedom. You're compelling them to stay. Now, I understand some people want to make it harder, but I don't think that's the answer. I think if two people come together and say, we don't want to be in this relationship anymore, that's what freedom is all about.
Definitely.
Yeah. Also up threefold. Look at census data, 1910, 1920, 1930, in places like Milwaukee, Chicago, Philadelphia. A young black kid was slightly more likely to be brought into a world with a father in the home married to the mother than a young white kid. We have incentivized this kind of bad behavior, and it's had a disproportionate.
But again, 1910, 1920, 1930, women couldn't have bank accounts. Matter of fact, women just got the vote in 1920s. What are you talking about? Women were considered property back then. And he said, yeah, you're right. They couldn't leave the relationships. So he's totally talking about a totally different time, legally, and even so. The statistics that he's comparing to today, it doesn't compute. Again, I might be the odd man out here, but they just don't compute to the reality of today and the freedoms that we have today.
Well, I understand that there were all these legal and social pressures on people to stay together. The curious side of me just wants to know if that's necessary. Like, I guess people don't want to stay together. Like, people want to dissolve their marriages so badly that you have to have all of those social pressures just to make them last a lifetime. That's kind of a black pill type realization if that's the case. So,
But don't forget, he's about 1910. That means women didn't have the right to vote. They were literally considered property.
yeah.
Back
Mhm.
then.
Well,
So-
it's funny because people will say like, "Oh," unironically say that's good. They want to go back to women not being able to vote because they think that's where all the problems come from. When I think it's really far more complicated. It's just that, as you know, if we're from a society where women could not vote, and then we become a society where women can vote, right? So it's like as we're moving like away from quote tradition, like there's always the possibility of the moving away from tradition can always go too far. The pendulum can always go too far. And it's like just because it went too far in some instances, like going away from the nuclear family or going away from traditional avenues of success, like education, people have this kind of, I think, simplistic tendency to say, well, then we have to revert back completely to the beginning. You know, we have to take away the right to women's vote. And I'm like, I think we can do both. I think women can vote and we can have nuclear families and all these other good things in our society.
Definitely bad effect on the black community.
Let me ask you a question. What do white people do wrong, Larry Elder?
What do you mean? What do white people do? I'm not worried about white people. I'm worried about what's going on with
But
us.
if there's systemic racism in this country, which we know it is.
No, I don't say there is. You say there is. I don't believe that.
Oh, you don't believe there's
No,
systemic
there used to
racism?
be, obviously. Tell me what you think the number one systemic example of systemic racism is in America.
Oh man, there's so many.
Just give me the most important one you think.
But at the top of mind, I probably maybe say mass incarceration, maybe.
Really?
Well, so before we get into mass incarceration, this is a very interesting social interaction. Kind of because we were talking about Peter Boghossian about how to have these difficult conversations. It's interesting that so Larry Elder comes on, even though we've been talking for like 3 hours or whatever, 2 hours. He's only been talking for like 5 minutes, and the question that is immediately asked of him is, "But what about white people? What are white people doing wrong?" And it's fascinating to me that there's this social dynamic where he has to address sort of the elephant in the room. He has to sort of do some kind of prayer to acknowledge that he's like not, an evil, blackface of white supremacy kind of individual in order for people to listen to what he's saying.
I don't think that's what's going on. I think he's saying that there are problems in the black community and he's blaming that on the black community. And he's countering the argument to say, no, the problems with the black community are the white community. I think that's what's going on.
Yeah, but he specifically asked him, but what are white people doing wrong?
Right. In the context of what he just said about the black community. I think that's my read. Nate, you want to weigh in?
No, that's exactly what I agree with you. I think what he's trying with Larry's just explaining, hey, here are all the problems with the black community, and Charlemagne's probably trying to introduce the white community to try to say, hey, what are they doing? What are they doing that are hurting the black community? And I think that's where you start to get attention. But I also think it's interesting to note that before we were comparing 1910 to 2020, but now when they start comparing mass incarceration, now you see Larry Elder's now got a distinction. Well, hold on, we got to talk about the past. Now he's separating the past and the future. So now the temporal relationship is important when it comes to mass incarceration, but it wasn't important when we were talking about families and marriage. So
that's true.
And I think actually Charlemagne the God, I think, does pretty good in this debate, surprisingly. Like he steps back and lets the woman make all the horrific errors. And when he has something to say, it's usually like the mass incarceration. I think obviously you could have a discussion about that. He didn't say the problem is the wall. Like it's not just like a complete airball, right? Sitch, you want to say something?
Well, it's interesting because we were talking to Peter about these conversations, and he would say well, if you're trying to connect with the Breakfast Club hosts and the audience, Larry should acknowledge all the racisms and horrible stuff that white people have essentially done throughout history, just to show them that he's sort of acknowledging some level of sharing their worldview to some extent, as opposed to just completely refusing to even talk about it, which he does in this conversation. But from Larry's perspective, since he's running for president as a Republican, maybe it doesn't behoove him to sort of even adapt that framing at all. Maybe it is better for him to just completely reject even talking about it.
Even in this interaction, if you just rewind it maybe 20 seconds, he says yes, there was systemic racism in the country, right, back in the 50s and 60s. But then he says now I don't think that's true. So he is making a point that hey, that was a problem, but now it's a different story in 2023. But then again, like I said, point back to just his last point about marriage in 2023 is it it seems like he's doing the same thing. He's accepting the differences in when it comes to mass incarceration, but not accepting it when it comes to something like marriage.
Right.
During the Great Depression, 50% of black adults were unemployed. You didn't have this kind of mass incarceration. It's the breakdown of the family. There's a direct.
I'm not going to. I agree with the family part. I'm a black man who is a father to his children, and I'm a happily married black man to a black woman. So I'm never going to argue with that part, But I just feel like everything is black with you. Black is wrong. Black people do this and black people do that. And when I ask you what white people do wrong, you said you're not worried about white people at all.
I'm talking about the damage, disproportionate damage going on in the black community. For example, look at these smash and grabs that are taking place in Los Angeles, where I live. There's a suburb called Glendale, where at a mall recently, a mob of 30 to 40 people, they had masks on, but one guy got popped. He was black, and I think most of those who were doing this were black. And in recent years and times, there have been a number of these in places like Chicago, places like New York. If I were involved in something like that, Charlemagne, I grew up with a dad, just as you're raising your own children. I would have been more afraid of my father than I would about the cops catching me. These kids are afraid of neither. They don't have a father in the home. Cops are demoralized. They're pulling back. Their manpower is short. And as a result, you tell a bad guy you're less likely to be caught, convicted, incarcerated, crime goes up. They may be criminals, but they're not stupid. Mm-hmm. When you say, what do white people do? I mean, this is a country that has struggled mightily to get over its historic racism. There was a civil war. There was a big civil rights movement. This is the only majority white country that's ever elected a black president, let alone reelected a black president. The three biggest cities in America are New York, Chicago, LA. They all have black mayors, even though no city has a majority of black population. The president of Harvard is a black female. Martin Luther King in 1966, Charlemagne, gave an interview to the BBC. This is 2 years after the Civil Rights Act of 64 got passed. And he said, I'm amazed at how many positive changes there have been in America in the last 2 years. Why, if things keep going like this, we could have a black president in about 40 years' time. Mm-hmm. Do the math. Right on cue, Barack Obama elected 2008. He didn't say there'll be a black female president of Harvard, and there has been. He didn't say there are going to be black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and there have been several. He didn't say the percentage of the House would equal the percentage of black people in the population, and it does. He didn't say the three largest cities would have black mayors, and they do. He didn't say the largest and most prestigious organization of doctors, the American Medical Association, would have 2 black presidents, and there have been. He didn't say the most prestigious organization of lawyers, the American Bar Association, would have 2 black presidents, and they have. He said president, meaning at that point, I can feel that I've reached the mountaintop, which is the speech he gave right before he got assassinated the day before. And now we act as if Barack Obama never even got elected. And we're still talking about systemic racism. It's not fair. It's wrong. And you're discouraging black people from working hard. 1990s.
Okay. It's funny because I agree, like when he's laying out, like, the progress that's been made in our country, I agree with everything he's saying completely, 100%. Yes. And it's funny because I can feel all the people on the left.
So
like,
angry.
They're just, like it's just not connecting. They're just getting, like, I could feel like their heckles raising. They're like, no, stop it.
So much of that, I wonder if it's the economic environment that we're in. Because obviously I'm a homeowner. I live in Southern California. I'm not really scraping by, but in my 20s, I was scraping by just like everybody tends to do in their 20s. And I just don't know if what the experience is like in general for the 20-year-old today, what scraping by is for them. Because when I was in my 20s scraping by, I was poor, obviously, but I didn't feel like society was stacked against me. I could always get a job. I always had, enough money to eat. It wasn't really a struggle, like a super painful struggle. So, but if people are struggling in ways that are very, very painful and seem very, very unfair, I mean, that's going to map onto the situation. I mean, it's going to be easier to make the argument, the socialists to make the argument, the critical race theorists to make the argument that everything is stacked against you for whatever reason they choose to pick.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think listening to what he was saying, it's kind of come full circle, where one side is saying, hey, we're still living in the 50 out. No, it's like at one point they were arguing reverse. Now they're arguing it on the other side, where Charlemagne's like, we're in the 50s, systemic racism. And he's like, what are you talking about? This 2023, it's over. But then when you go back a couple of minutes, one side is like, it's 2023. He's like, no, go back to the 50s. So it's hard to find out where they want to be at. But I think everything that Larry Elder said is definitely correct. And I think at a point, sometimes it's easier to fight and tell people they're being oppressed than tell people to look within and try to do what's necessary to fix your own problem. Because it's easy for me to say it's the white people's fault that I'm not a millionaire versus me to say it's my fault because I didn't get out there and get up off my ass and did what I needed to do to make it happen.
Hi, you just listened to a clip from the Sitch and Adams show. If you like what you heard, you can listen to our live show right here on this channel on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And if you want, you can super chat us. We read $20 and up super chats on the show and then do a follow-up stream on the following Tuesday where we read the rest of the unread super chats and interact with fans of the show. Subscribe to this channel right here to listen to the live show or to listen to more of our awesome clips.